I'm a 30-year-old woman, and I've been married to my husband Mark for almost 4 years now. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood that looks like something straight out of a real estate brochure. The lawns are trimmed, the houses look uniform, and everything has that air of perfect community living. The catch, of course, is that our neighborhood has one of the strictest HOAs imaginable. When we first moved in, I actually read through the entire handbook to make sure we didn't break any rules. Back then, it felt like overkill, but it turns out that detail would come in handy later. My job allows me to work from home, so weekends are the time I look forward to the most. That's when I recharge, catch up on personal things, or just enjoy quiet mornings without email pings or video calls. Mark works longer hours outside the house, so our weekends are really the only time we get to breathe together. That was the plan anyway, until his parents decided otherwise. Mark's parents, Linda and Paul, are the kind of people who believe family traditions are sacred, and in their world, Sunday gatherings are non-negotiable. Mark grew up with that routine. Every Sunday, his mom would cook a big meal. The family would sit together, and no one dared to miss it. It wasn't optional, it was a rule. When we got married, I assumed that tradition would stay at their place. But Linda had other plans. Practically the moment we returned from our honeymoon, she made it clear that Sundays would now happen at our house. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe it was temporary, maybe she just wanted to celebrate us as newlyweds, and soon things would balance out. Instead, it became clear very quickly that this was going to be permanent. Every single Sunday, they were at our door, sometimes with pastries in hand, sometimes with pots of food, but always expecting to be let in. Linda would bustle straight into the kitchen as if she lived there, rearranging items in the fridge, offering commentary on how I organized the pantry, or telling me which brands of dish soap were best. She never asked, she just acted like she was in charge. Paul, on the other hand, had an obsession with pointing out flaws. He would stand in the yard and criticize how the grass looked, how the driveway wasn't swept enough, or how our hedge needed trimming. Once, when our trash bin was still at the curb a few hours after pickup, he reminded us that neighbors notice these things. He had no problem lecturing us, even though it wasn't his house. The irony that he and Linda lived only 3 streets away made the whole thing feel even more ridiculous. They had their own place, yet insisted our house should be the hub. Hosting them every week wasn't just about opening the door. It meant constant cleaning, vacuuming, wiping surfaces, preparing food, and making sure everything looked presentable. Even if Linda brought food, she still expected me to play hostess. If I tried to keep things casual, she would make comments like, "Oh, you didn't set the table properly," or "I guess you don't entertain much." It was exhausting, and it ate into every single weekend. The more it went on, the more it felt like I didn't actually live in my own house. My space turned into their gathering spot, and I was just maintaining it for them. I tried to raise it with Mark gently, explaining that maybe we could start rotating Sundays, or at least cut back to every other week. His response was always the same. "That's just how my parents are. Don't take it personally." He grew up used to their overbearing presence, so he didn't see what the big deal was. To him, this was normal. But to me, it was draining, and it was stealing the only time we had for ourselves. When I suggested alternating Sundays or having them host once in a while, Linda shut it down immediately. She claimed it was anti-family, and that gatherings only worked if everyone was together. Then she added that her house wasn't as suitable for entertaining, which made no sense considering hers was just as big as ours, if not bigger. Every excuse came back to the same outcome. Our house was the gathering point, and she wasn't budging. The more this routine dragged on, the more I started to dread Sundays. Instead of relaxing, I spent Saturdays preparing for the invasion and Sundays cleaning up after. My weekends disappeared, and the resentment started building. The space I once loved felt less like home and more like a stage I had to keep ready for an audience. The kitchen wasn't just mine anymore, it was Linda's playground. The yard wasn't just ours, it was a target for Paul's running commentary. Even when they weren't physically there, I felt their presence hanging over me. One small detail kept nagging at the back of my mind. When we first bought the house, I had read through the HOA rulebook front to back. I remembered thinking how ridiculously strict it was. There were rules for everything: where you could park, how long trash bins could stay at the curb, what kind of decorations were allowed, even the type of fencing you could install. At the time, I rolled my eyes, but I filed the details away in my head. Now, with my weekends consumed and my patience running thin, those rules didn't just look like a nuisance anymore. They looked like an opportunity. It was almost funny, really. Paul was so quick to point out what we should be doing to uphold community standards, yet he didn't seem nearly as concerned about his own compliance. And Linda, who strutted into my house every week as though she set the tone for the neighborhood, wasn't exactly a model resident either. If the rules were strict enough to make me anxious about where I left my trash bin, surely they could apply to everyone, Linda and Paul included. That thought sat with me for days. Every time I wiped down the counters after they left or packed away leftovers I never asked for, it came back to me. Maybe the same HOA rulebook that made this neighborhood so rigid could finally give me the leverage I needed. At the very least, it was worth finding out. Linda didn't slow down with the Sunday gatherings. If anything, she leaned into them harder. One evening during cleanup, she casually announced that she had been thinking ahead and proposed a new system. Instead of just always showing up at my place, she suggested rotating between her, Mark's siblings, and us. On the surface, it sounded fair, until she added the detail that our house would still be the main hub. Her reasoning was that ours was the biggest and most comfortable, which was only partly true. What she left out was that she simply didn't want to deal with hosting herself. Not long after that, I started noticing things in the neighborhood. Linda often left her SUV parked overnight on the street, which I knew from the rulebook was a violation. Cars had to be in driveways or garages, no exceptions. Paul, on the other hand, had a habit of leaving the trash bins out days after pickup, The handbook specifically said bins had to be brought in the same day, but theirs often sat at the curb until Wednesday or Thursday. I wasn't the only one who noticed either. The HOA had recently gotten stricter about sending warnings and fines. Linda brushed those off like they were nothing. I overheard her laughing about one of the letters with a neighbor, calling it petty nonsense. That same week, she walked into my kitchen carrying a casserole and made a snide comment about how my garden looked a little bare compared to the rest of the neighborhood. It was bold, considering she had weeds taller than her fence line. After that, I started paying closer attention. Paul had recently put up a small shed in their backyard. It wasn't approved by the HOA, and it was definitely larger than what the rules allowed. He also liked to park in front of the fire hydrant near their house, which wasn't just against HOA guidelines but against city code too. Each time I spotted one of these things, I remembered the pile of rules I had read when we moved in. They weren't suggestions, they were rules. The same rules Paul loved to hold over me when he commented on our lawn. Instead of saying anything out loud, I took photos. A quick snap of the SUV parked out front overnight, another of the trash bins still sitting at the curb midweek, a shot of the shed going up with no permit sticker in sight. At first, I hesitated, but eventually, I sent the evidence through the HOA's online complaint system. Everything was anonymous. I attached the photos and filled out the form like any other neighbor might. It didn't take long for the board to respond. Within a week, Linda and Paul received formal violation letters. They were hit with fines and deadlines to correct each issue. The next Sunday, Linda stormed into my kitchen holding one of the letters in her hand. She slammed it down on the counter and started venting about some nosy neighbor who clearly had it out for them. Paul muttered about corruption and favoritism, though I noticed he avoided making direct eye contact with anyone. For the first time since these Sunday visits had started, the energy shifted. They weren't in control anymore, and they knew it. I stayed quiet, pouring drinks and setting plates while they stewed. Mark tried to change the subject, but Linda circled back to the letter more than once, insisting someone in the neighborhood was tattling. She waved the paper like a flag of injustice, yet never considered that maybe they were actually at fault. The following week, things escalated even more. Linda parked her SUV on the street again, ignoring the first fine, and the HOA doubled it. Paul's shed got flagged as an unapproved structure, and they were given 30 days to either tear it down or submit costly paperwork for review. The trash bin issue turned into repeat offenses, which meant repeat fines. When they showed up that Sunday, the mood was heavy. Linda's smile looked forced, and Paul barely spoke. They picked at the food they had brought, both of them irritated. At one point, Paul slipped into the living room and made a phone call, his voice low but tense. He mentioned appeals and unfair treatment as though someone had it out for them specifically. Linda still tried to keep her usual air of superiority, making small digs about my choice of cookware and rearranging the napkins I had set out. But there was a new edge to it, less confidence and more irritation. It didn't go unnoticed that they were spending more time glaring out the window than chatting over dinner. Over the next week, more letters arrived for them. Linda had placed new planters along her front yard without approval, and someone had reported it. Paul's habit of idling his truck in no parking zones near the intersection was also flagged. Each violation came with photos, proof, and deadlines. By then, Linda was venting to Mark almost daily. She would call and complain about the board, complain about spiteful neighbors, complain about how the rules were suddenly being enforced when for years no one cared. She never once admitted to breaking the rules herself. The best part was watching Paul's paranoia grow. He started glaring at anyone who walked past their house, even waving at a jogger to slow down and stop snooping. He spent an entire afternoon watering his lawn while scanning the street, convinced someone was spying on him. Meanwhile, I didn't have to lift a finger. The system was already in motion. Each time they ignored a warning, the fines grew. Each time they tried to brush it off, another letter landed in their mailbox. Their frustration mounted, and with it the tension at our Sunday dinners. One evening, after Linda dropped off another dessert she hadn't been asked to bring, she muttered under her breath that the board would regret messing with the wrong family. Paul grunted in agreement, but didn't look nearly as confident. He was the one footing the bills, after all. At that point, the dynamic had completely shifted. Where Linda once strutted in with confidence, she now arrived with a hint of worry in her eyes. Where Paul once doled out criticism about my yard or driveway, he now sat stiffly, checking his phone for updates from the HOA. Their grip on the family gatherings was slipping, even if they didn't realize it fully yet. I continued documenting quietly, never slipping, never revealing anything. Each photo was another nail in the coffin of their control. I didn't need to raise my voice or argue or even defend myself. The very handbook Paul once used as a weapon against me was now doing the work for me. By the end of that month, their mailbox had collected more notices than actual mail. The fines were stacking, the deadlines were closing in, and their reputation in the neighborhood was beginning to crack. The same neighbors they once tried to impress were now whispering about them, watching as the couple who once criticized others failed to meet the same standards. That Sunday, Linda sat at my kitchen table clutching her tea a little too tightly. She barely touched her food, and Paul kept shaking his head at his phone, scrolling through emails from the HOA. Neither of them mentioned my garden, my cooking, or my housekeeping. For once, the conversation wasn't about me at all. It was about them, their violations, and their growing list of problems. And I let it stay that way. Linda didn't take the first round of fines as a warning. Instead, she doubled down. One Sunday afternoon, after clearing plates at the table, she announced that gatherings at my house would continue until this nonsense with the HOA stopped. She said it like it was a fact, not a suggestion. She acted as though holding Sunday dinners at my place was some kind of protest against the rules she kept breaking. I didn't argue. Instead, the following week, I made sure our schedule was full. When she called to confirm their arrival, Mark told her we already had plans for the weekend. She pushed back, but Mark stood firm. For once, we weren't bending. That gave me the time I needed. In the meantime, I kept watching their house. Linda had added a line of ceramic lawn gnomes across her front yard, each brighter and more ridiculous than the last. The HOA handbook had an entire section about exterior decorations. Everything had to be approved, and tacky displays were an easy way to get flagged. I filed another report, attaching photos of the gnomes lined up like sentries along the walkway. Then there was Paul's trailer. It had been sitting in their driveway for weeks, sun-bleached, and obviously not in working order. The handbook clearly banned trailers from being stored in driveways for more than 48 hours unless they were actively being loaded or unloaded. This thing hadn't moved in ages. Another report went in with a time-stamped photo. The HOA didn't waste time. A few days later, violation letters landed in Linda and Paul's mailbox. They were fined for the unapproved decorations, and Paul was given a deadline to move the trailer or face daily escalating penalties. That Sunday, when they showed up at my house again, the change was obvious. Linda carried her usual casserole dish, but she looked strained. Her smile was thin, and she muttered under her breath about unfair treatment. Paul wasn't quiet at all. He launched into a rant about how the neighborhood had become filled with jealous people who couldn't stand to see others happy. He went on about how someone must have a personal grudge, targeting them deliberately. I stayed neutral. While setting the table, I casually asked whether they were sure everything was within compliance. The question hung in the air, and Linda stiffened. She glanced at Mark, almost as if expecting him to defend them, but he just shrugged. Paul barked back that the fines were illegal, though he offered no explanation as to how. The rest of the afternoon was tense. Paul kept pacing the living room, peeking out the window at passing cars, muttering about spies. Linda tried to redirect, asking Mark if he had noticed anyone snooping near their property. He brushed it off, saying he hadn't seen anything unusual. That didn't satisfy her, and she circled back to it several times, as though someone had been creeping around her house with binoculars. Then, in a surprising twist, Linda turned her attention to me. She said I knew the handbook better than anyone, and that I should help them with their appeals to the board. She tried to frame it like a compliment, praising my attention to detail, but the truth was obvious. She was drowning in fines and wanted someone else to do the legwork. I declined smoothly, saying I didn't want to get involved in disputes with the board. The look on her face said it all. She wasn't used to me refusing. She covered it with a tight smile and went back to stirring her tea, but her knuckles stayed white around the handle. Over the next week, things escalated at their house. The HOA followed up on the trailer, giving Paul a hard deadline. Daily fines would start if it wasn't gone by Friday. Linda's gnomes were labeled inappropriate outdoor decor and had to be removed within 10 days. When I passed their house one afternoon, I saw her pacing in the yard with a trash bag, scooping up the gnomes while muttering to herself. That Sunday, they still showed up, but Linda's cheerful mask was cracking. She looked tired, distracted, and less interested in playing hostess at my house. Paul, meanwhile, kept going on about how the board was corrupt, how neighbors were jealous, and how someone was trying to ruin their reputation. The more he ranted, the more obvious it became that he had no defense. He was just angry at being caught. I stayed calm, serving drinks and moving around the kitchen as if nothing unusual was happening. The more neutral I acted, the more they spiraled. By the end of the evening, Linda was asking Mark again whether he'd seen anyone hanging around their street. He brushed her off once more, saying he didn't pay much attention. Later that week, Linda called and tried once again to pull me into their mess. She said if I just helped draft a letter, the board might back off. She framed it as though I was the only one who could fix this. I reminded her that I wasn't part of the board and didn't want to interfere. She didn't argue after that, but the frustration in her voice was clear. Around that time, Mark began to notice things he had ignored before. He saw how much preparation went into Sundays, how much cleaning and rearranging fell on me, and how drained I looked after everyone left. For the first time, he admitted it was wearing on me and that his parents were asking too much. The following weekend, Linda didn't show up. No casserole, no SUV in the driveway, no calls confirming their arrival. For the first time in months, Sunday was quiet. Mark and I had breakfast on our own schedule, went for a walk, and came back to a silent house. It was strange, but in the best way. The reason became clear when I passed by their place the next day. The trailer was still sitting in the driveway, but now with a bright orange sticker on it, warning of fines if it wasn't moved immediately. Their mailbox bulged with letters. The gnomes were gone, but new weeds were sprouting along the walkway, almost like they had given up on yard upkeep altogether. The pressure from the HOA was finally hitting them hard enough to interrupt the tradition they thought was unshakable. Sunday dinners that once felt permanent were no longer guaranteed. For the first time since the whole mess began, the cracks in their control were showing. After skipping a Sunday for the first time in months, Linda came back the following week as if nothing unusual had happened. She showed up at the door holding a box of pastries, smiling too brightly and talking louder than normal. She breezed into the kitchen, setting the box down like it was a peace offering. Her cheerful tone felt exaggerated, as though she was determined to prove everything was fine. It didn't take long before the cracks showed. Whenever the HOA came up in casual conversation, neighbors, landscaping, or anything even loosely related, Linda's smile wavered. She dismissed the fines they had been getting, waving them off as simple misunderstandings. She said things like the board was overzealous, or paperwork had been misplaced, anything to avoid admitting they were in the wrong. Paul was less subtle. He had grown jumpy, glaring at anyone who walked past their house. If a neighbor slowed their car near the curb, he narrowed his eyes and muttered about spies. He started watching people like they were all suspects. At my house, he sat by the window instead of at the table, peeking through the blinds and keeping his truck keys in his hand. That afternoon, while I was in the kitchen pouring drinks, I overheard Linda whispering to Mark. She was telling him that the family had to stay united against outsiders. She lowered her voice, but I caught enough to understand. She wanted to spin the story so the HOA fines weren't about them breaking rules. They were about neighbors trying to divide the family. When we sat down for dinner, I made a simple comment about how rules applied equally to everyone in the neighborhood. Linda froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. For a moment, the cheerful mask slipped, and she looked stiff, like she'd been caught off guard. She quickly changed the subject, but the tension lingered. Paul's paranoia didn't stop at their own house. He started idling his truck in front of mine, claiming he was keeping an eye out for anyone suspicious. Sometimes he'd sit there for half an hour, engine running, just staring down the street. I snapped a photo from the upstairs window and sent it in. The HOA issued him another violation notice, this time with escalating penalties for repeat offenses. Linda seemed to realize things were getting out of hand, so she shifted tactics. Instead of barging in with criticism, she tried softening her approach. She started bringing full meals instead of just side dishes, roasts, salads, desserts, expecting gratitude for the effort. She presented them with a smile, as though the food alone would erase the problems. But I stopped rearranging my weekends around her. If she showed up with a meal, fine, but I didn't change my own plans anymore. One Sunday, I had already made lunch for myself and didn't touch the dish she brought. That small act made it clear I wasn't going to keep catering every week. The following visit, Linda's cheerful mask slipped again. She snapped at me, saying my job was easier than Mark's since I worked from home. Mark happened to be walking past when she said it, and he didn't let it slide. He cut her off, pointing out that my work was just as demanding, if not more. Linda went quiet, clearly not expecting him to defend me. Paul muttered something about disrespect, but Mark stayed silent and didn't give him the reaction he wanted. The room grew quiet after that, the only sound the clinking of cutlery against plates. Not long after, another violation landed in Linda and Paul's mailbox. The HOA gave them an official deadline to remove Paul's trailer within 2 weeks. If it wasn't gone by then, they would face daily fines on top of the existing penalties. The letter spelled it out clearly. No exceptions, no excuses. The weight of multiple fines was starting to show. Linda's smile was weaker, her tone sharper, and Paul was quicker to anger. Their once confident presence had turned sour. When they walked into my house now, the air felt heavier, conversations grew shorter, and meals were eaten in awkward silence. One Sunday, Linda brought a full spread of food, but no one seemed interested. The chatter that once filled the kitchen was gone, replaced with strained small talk and long pauses. Paul barely touched his plate, distracted by his phone buzzing with HOA reminders. Linda picked at her food, trying to make light conversation that didn't land. The very tradition they had forced so fiercely was beginning to falter. The energy was gone, replaced with tension and unease. What had once been a weekly invasion of my space was slowly crumbling under the pressure of rules they couldn't ignore. For the first time, it seemed like their enthusiasm for these gatherings was slipping away. Paul finally moved the trailer, but not without turning it into a spectacle. For 3 straight days, he grumbled in the driveway, pulling tools out, hammering at loose panels, and loudly complaining about the HOA to anyone within earshot. The thing wasn't even roadworthy, so a tow truck had to come and haul it away. Neighbors stood outside watching, whispering behind their hands. By the time it was gone, Paul was red-faced and still muttering about how unfair it all was. Not long after, Linda pulled Mark aside in my kitchen while I was rinsing dishes. She lowered her voice, asking him to talk to me about easing up. She claimed things were being blown out of proportion, and if I stopped being so rigid, the tension would disappear. I stayed out of it, but Mark's patience was wearing thin. Later that evening, when we were cleaning up, he finally suggested something new. Maybe Sunday gatherings should rotate between households. It was a fair idea, but Linda immediately dismissed it. She said her house wasn't good for hosting, that it wasn't as spacious, and that ours was simply better suited. The excuse was weak. Their house was actually bigger than ours, and had more yard space. I pointed it out politely the next time it came up, undercutting her reasoning in front of everyone. Linda's smile faltered, but before she could respond, Paul jumped in, claiming their yard was under renovation. The problem was, no such work was happening. Their yard looked exactly the same, weeds and all. I reminded him calmly that leaving yard projects unfinished could also trigger HOA violations. He went quiet after that, pretending to scroll through his phone. Behind closed doors, Mark admitted something I hadn't heard before. He said he was starting to feel drained too. The weekly pressure, the constant criticism, and his parents' stubbornness were finally getting to him. It wasn't just me anymore. He was beginning to see the toll it took on both of us. That week, Linda added something new to her yard. A line of string lights appeared across the fence, glowing at night in colors that clashed with everything else. The HOA handbook was clear. Exterior lighting had to be pre-approved. I took another photo and sent it in. The violation letter arrived within days. Linda was furious. When she came over that Sunday, her usual cheerful entrance was replaced with red eyes and trembling hands. She was close to tears, swearing she would take the lights down immediately and blaming petty neighbors for targeting her. Paul was less quiet. His frustration boiled over at the table. He slammed his hand down, ranting about how the HOA was destroying family traditions and meddling where they didn't belong. Mark didn't let it slide this time. He looked directly at his father and said firmly that this was our home, and we decide what happens here. The silence that followed was heavy. Paul leaned back, visibly stunned, and for once, he didn't have a comeback. It was clear something had shifted. Mark wasn't brushing things aside anymore. He wasn't asking me to tolerate it or downplaying their behavior. He was standing with me, openly setting boundaries in front of them. Linda tried to smooth things over, offering nervous laughter and promising to fix the lights, but she looked worn down, and the energy she once brought into the house was gone. By the end of dinner, she quietly suggested maybe it would be best to take a short break from Sunday gatherings until things calmed down. It wasn't said with conviction, more like a desperate attempt to buy time. But it was the first sign that the tradition they had forced for so long was no longer unshakable. The balance of power had shifted. 2 weeks passed without a Sunday visit, and the house finally felt like it belonged to me again. But just when it seemed like the break might last, Linda showed up unannounced one afternoon, balancing a tray of baked goods. She knocked once before letting herself in, acting like everything was back to normal. She placed the food on the counter, setting plates like she was reclaiming her routine. I didn't rush to entertain her. I kept doing what I was already doing, waiting until Mark came downstairs to join us. He looked surprised to see his parents there again, but Linda acted like the pause had never happened. She started setting the table, insisting on arranging things neatly. Paul followed soon after, walking in with heavy steps and a scowl. He sat at the table without a word at first, but within minutes he was lecturing about respecting elders. His voice grew louder, his hand pounding against the wood for emphasis. The whole room fell quiet as his words echoed. Mark didn't let it pass. He told his father to lower his voice, not angrily but firmly enough to stop him. Paul looked shocked, as though no one had ever spoken to him like that at his own family table. The silence stretched, and Linda quickly tried to smooth things over by passing plates around, pretending it hadn't happened. Halfway through the meal, I asked a question I had been holding back for months. I wanted to know why our house always had to be the center of these gatherings. Linda hesitated before admitting that she didn't like hosting at her own place. She worried about neighbors peeking in, judging how she kept her house. It wasn't about family bonding, it was about control. She wanted her space untouched, while ours carried the weight of every tradition. The next week, another HOA letter landed in their mailbox. This time, it was for trash bins left out all week. The fines were steep, and the letter mentioned that repeat violations could lead to further penalties. Paul's temper erupted. He stormed into our house with the notice crumpled in his hand, waving it around like proof of injustice. He accused me of feeding the board information, glaring across the table as if daring me to admit it. I didn't rise to it. I only asked if it wouldn't be easier to follow the rules instead of fighting them. My calm tone seemed to throw him off more than any argument could have. He barked back about unfair treatment, but his words carried less force than before. Linda jumped in, insisting I was misunderstanding their intentions. She claimed they just wanted family togetherness, and that none of this was meant to cause harm. But before she could keep going, Mark cut her off. He told them clearly that the real problem wasn't the HOA, or the neighbors, or me, it was their entitlement. He said they had treated our home like their own, ignoring the boundaries we tried to set. Paul shot up from his chair, his face red. He stormed out, the door slamming so hard it rattled the frames on the wall. The room went silent. Linda sat frozen at the table, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide. She didn't follow him right away. For the first time, she seemed to realize how far things had spiraled. The rest of the visit was awkward and short. Linda gathered the dishes in silence, her usual chatter gone. When she finally left, she carried the tray of baked goods back out with her, as though she couldn't bear to leave it behind. That night, Mark admitted he was done letting his parents dictate our lives. He said the constant intrusion had gone too far, and he wasn't willing to let them take over our weekends anymore. It wasn't a quiet comment made in passing. It was a decision, spoken out loud. The next day, I saw Paul in his driveway, kicking at the trash bins as if they were the enemy. The orange violation sticker was still plastered on the side, flapping in the wind. Neighbors passed by, glancing at him with raised brows, but no one stopped to talk. His reputation, once that of a man who lectured others about community standards, was unraveling. Linda, meanwhile, started showing signs of retreat. She no longer marched into my kitchen with authority. She called ahead hesitantly, asking if they could come by, and even then, her tone was subdued. But the damage had already been done. The breaking point had come, and there was no way to patch things back to the way they were. Sundays, once forced upon us, no longer held the same grip. What came next would decide whether the tradition collapsed completely or transformed into something different. But one thing was certain, the control Linda and Paul once had over our home was gone. The Sunday after Paul stormed out, I made no preparations. No cleaning spree, no extra food in the fridge, no table set ahead of time. Mark and I planned a quiet morning instead. Around noon, Linda called. She said she and Paul were on their way over. Mark didn't hesitate. He told her directly that we weren't hosting that day. She pushed back, her voice sharp, but Mark repeated himself once and ended the call. For the first time, the boundary was clear. That same week, another violation notice appeared in their mailbox. This time it was for their fence, which was deteriorating along the side facing the street. The HOA required repairs within 30 days, along with fines for non-compliance. Paul exploded. He stomped around his yard, holding the letter like a personal attack. Neighbors walking by slowed down to watch but didn't stop to speak. Linda stood nearby, worn out, murmuring half-hearted reassurances. Instead of storming into our house, they spent their time scrambling to deal with their own problems. Calls to contractors, tense conversations in the driveway, arguments over costs. The attention that once went into forcing Sunday traditions was now consumed by their growing list of home repairs and fines. The following Sunday came and went without a visit. Mark and I had breakfast, went out for a walk and came back to silence. No SUV in the driveway, no knocks at the door. For the first time in years, Sunday felt like ours. Over the next few weeks, the pattern held. Linda and Paul stayed focused on their house. The fence repairs started, with workers hammering and drilling all day. The lawn was trimmed, weeds pulled, and the front walkway finally cleared. Paul moved his truck into the garage at night instead of idling on the street. Linda even pulled down some of her lawn ornaments, leaving bare spots where once there had been clutter. At first, it felt strange. The people who once filled every Sunday with noise and demands were now absent, tied up with their own compliance issues. Slowly, Sundays turned into days for us. We started inviting friends over, cooking small meals just for ourselves, or spending the day out instead of chained to the house. Mark noticed the difference immediately. Without the constant pressure, our weekends were lighter. He admitted one night that he hadn't realized how draining the routine had been until it stopped. He said he was glad we had taken back control. Meanwhile, Linda tried small gestures to repair the dynamic. Instead of demanding gatherings at our house, she began inviting us to hers. She started small, like asking if we wanted to stop by for coffee, nothing formal. Sometimes we went, sometimes we didn't, but the important part was that it was an invitation, not an expectation. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it was steady. The unspoken rule of Sundays at our house was gone. If there was a gathering, it was optional, and if there wasn't, life went on. One afternoon, I walked past their house and saw Paul repainting the fence after the repairs. Linda was sweeping the walkway, her movements slower than before. A neighbor waved as they walked by, and instead of glaring, Paul gave a stiff nod. Their pride had taken a hit, but their behavior was finally starting to change. The gossip in the neighborhood also shifted. Where once people whispered about their arrogance, now they talked about how much quieter things had become. The couple who had once dismissed rules as petty nonsense were suddenly the most cautious about following them. At home, Mark and I filled the space that had once been occupied by their presence. We started new routines, Sunday brunches just for us, afternoons spent gardening, evenings watching movies. The house finally felt like ours again, not a stage for someone else's tradition. The control Linda and Paul once had dissolved, not through arguments or blow-ups, but through consistency and boundaries. Each fine, each notice, each time Mark stood firm, chipped away at their ability to dictate how we lived. In the end, they weren't the ones to end the tradition. The HOA and their own refusal to follow the rules did it for them. Now, when I think about those Sundays, they feel like a different lifetime. The pressure is gone, replaced by peace. Linda still makes gestures here and there, but they're softer, less intrusive. She asks instead of assumes. Paul keeps his opinions about lawns and driveways to himself. The cycle that once felt unbreakable finally ended, and it ended on our terms.